After World War I, the collapse of the international order, the excessive suppression of the defeated countries by the victors, and the rise of fascism, which used violence as an important means to achieve national interests and national revival against the backdrop of economic crisis and social unrest. Stimulated by a series of such factors, the skies over the conflict-ridden European continent in the 1930s were already filled with dark clouds. On September 1st, 1939, marked by Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland, whose ambitions had been repeatedly indulged by the international community. Less than 21 years after the end of World War I, another world war broke out in this way. In the first few years of World War II, the Axis powers, led by Nazi Germany, had a significant advantage due to their new strategies and military innovations. By 1942, the powerful Axis bloc controlled 45% of the world's land area and 35% of the global population at the time. Without the involvement of the Americans, it might have been difficult to predict the direction in which World War II would have developed. The United States officially joined the war in the third year of World War II. The 3 years of hesitation and deliberation largely reflected a shift in the attitude of most Americans towards the war at that time. Faced with a severe domestic economic crisis and the increasingly serious threat of war internationally, along with the trauma from the previous war, isolationism was prevalent in the United States at the time. Apart from the Americas, Americans did not want to be overly involved in the troublesome international affairs. From 1935 to 1937, the United States passed a series of neutrality acts, such as arms embargoes. However, just like in World War I, when countries around the world, increasingly interconnected, faced global conflicts, it was evidently difficult for them to remain unaffected amidst the intertwining of interests and crises. Especially for a major power like the United States, which holds significant weight in international affairs. Compared to the majority of Americans who took a conservative stance, President Roosevelt at the time realized early on that the reality did not allow the United States to pursue isolationism for long. In fact, considering democratic values, economic interests, and security threats, Roosevelt, from the beginning of the war, leaned towards supporting the Allies such as Britain and France. In 1939, to provide military support to the Allies against the highly efficient German war industry, Roosevelt requested Congress to amend the Neutrality Act. He hoped to lift the arms embargo, but due to strong opposition from domestic isolationists, the Neutrality Act was subsequently revised to allow belligerent nations to purchase weapons on a cash-and-carry basis. As one of the leading powers in Europe, France's defeat in June 1940 was unexpected to many and prompted a shift in American public opinion. After France's defeat, a Gallup poll from that year showed that 66% of Americans began to believe that Germany posed a direct threat to the United States. The rapid escalation of the war threat led to a weakening of isolationist forces within the United States. Interventionists began advocating for greater U.S. involvement in the war. In September of the same year, the U.S. Congress approved the first peacetime military draft in history, and the Burke-Wadsworth Act initiated a nationwide conscription system to prepare for the potential war. Meanwhile, in the United States, people's attitudes gradually shifted, and the foresighted Roosevelt had already increased aid to the Allies. In May of that year, after requesting an additional $1 billion from Congress for defense spending, Roosevelt, facing the appeal of the then British Prime Minister Churchill, took a significant political risk by providing war materials to Britain, despite some people's skepticism about Britain's ability to withstand Germany's offensive. He bypassed the Neutrality Acts and passed the Destroyers for Bases Agreement, which provided 50 destroyers to Britain in exchange for military base rights for the United States in the British Caribbean islands and Newfoundland. In 1940, as the war situation for the Allies continued to deteriorate, the United States faced another presidential election year. Amidst the fierce debate between isolationism and interventionism regarding defense issues, Roosevelt, through his skillful neutral stance and his strong performance in handling the economic crisis, as well as his exceptional leadership and political acumen demonstrated in the context of World War II, Roosevelt in that year secured victory once again by receiving 55% of the popular vote and 449 electoral votes, thus commencing his unprecedented third term as president. After winning the election, Roosevelt began to more actively steer the United States towards direct involvement in governance. In December 1940, facing a Britain that was essentially bankrupt and unable to continue the cash-and-carry policy, Roosevelt proposed the Lend-Lease Act, which was approved by Congress. The implementation of the Lend-Lease Act allowed the United States to become the arsenal of the Allies without directly participating in the war, significantly alleviating the material shortages and economic difficulties of the Allies and enhancing their combat effectiveness and resilience. According to records, by 1944, a total of 38 countries had received aid under the Lend-Lease Act, with a total value exceeding $48 billion, and the increasingly close relationship with the Allies was, of course, also intended to send a warning to the fascist countries committing numerous atrocities. In August 1941, the United States and the United Kingdom jointly issued the Atlantic Charter, aimed at rebuilding world peace and order, which was also a way for the United States to declare its war objectives in another form. In short, by this critical juncture, the question of whether the United States would enter the war seemed no longer a matter of if, but when. For Roosevelt, he still needed an opportunity, one that would allow the American public to also support the United States entering the war. This opportunity soon appeared in the Pacific. In Japan, after the invasion of the Indochina Peninsula in 1940, the United States imposed a comprehensive trade embargo on Japan, which severely affected the import of essential goods, including war materials. Faced with the choice of repairing US-Japan relations to restore the supply of goods, or continuing expansion to acquire the rich resources of Southeast Asia to solve the current predicament, the arrogant and aggressive Japan chose the latter. On December 7, 1941, to eliminate the threat posed by the US Pacific Fleet to Japan's Southern Fleet plans, Japan launched a surprise attack on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. In just 2 hours, the unprepared Americans lost dozens of ships, hundreds of aircraft, and over 2,000 soldiers. The outbreak of the Pearl Harbor incident ignited intense anger and anti-Japanese sentiment among the American public. Their patriotic fervor and determination to fight were thoroughly aroused, and it also made Roosevelt realize that it was time for the United States to join the battle. On December 8, Roosevelt delivered his famous Day of Infamy speech in Congress, declaring December 7th as a day of infamy for America, which later became a day of remembrance in the United States. Subsequently, the Senate unanimously and the House of Representatives by a vote of 388 to 1 approved the declaration of war against Japan. On December 10th, Japan's European allies, Germany and Italy, declared war on the United States, and the next day, Congress unanimously passed the declaration. The approval to engage in war set in motion a war machine that had been underestimated by the Axis powers, now fully activated, to express the firm belief of the anti-fascist allies in their common goals and principles, and to establish a unified anti-fascist front. On January 1st, 1942, 26 countries including the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union and China jointly signed the declaration by United Nations in Washington. The declaration stated that the signatory countries would use all available resources to participate in the war, granting the enemy no separate armistice agreements or treaties. Although the United States was highly enthusiastic and acted swiftly after entering the war, the situation at that time was not optimistic. The United Kingdom was on the brink of collapse, the Soviet Union was in a precarious state, and the Allies' strongholds in the Pacific theater were falling one after another into the hands of the Japanese forces. To deal with Japan, the United States launched a two-pronged attack. One route was led by General Douglas MacArthur, planning to advance north from Australia to New Guinea and finally circle back to the Philippines. The other route was led by Admiral Chester Nimitz, planning to attack westward from Hawaii towards the Japanese island bases in the Central Pacific. Ultimately, the two routes would converge to attack the Japanese mainland. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 was the first strategic victory for the US military since entering the war, and it was also the first time the Japanese forces were thwarted in their offensive strategy. In this battle, the Allies thwarted the Japanese attempt to isolate Australia and New Zealand with the Port Moresby operation, gaining enough time for future strategic deployments. The Battle of Midway, which broke out in June of the same year, is often regarded as the turning point of the Pacific War. With a decisive victory achieved in this battle, the US military reversed the passive situation it had been in since the start of the war, while the Japanese lost the strategic dominance they had held since the beginning of the conflict. Subsequently, the naval power balance between the US and Japan in the Western Pacific began to be restored. In August, to protect the shipping routes between the United States, Australia and New Zealand, the US military launched an offensive on Guadalcanal and the surrounding islands in the Western Pacific, leading to 6 months of fierce fighting. The Japanese forces were forced to abandon the island, thereby completely losing the ability to continue expanding on the Pacific Islands. In October 1944, the Allies and the Japanese engaged in what is considered the largest naval battle in history near Leyte Island in the Philippines. In this battle, both sides deployed a combined total of over 2 million tons of ships and more than 200,000 combat personnel. Although the Allies suffered heavy losses under the nearly frenzied attacks of the Japanese forces, the latter still achieved a decisive victory. After this battle, the combat power of the Japanese Navy was almost dismantled, while the United States secured its dominance in the Pacific, creating conditions that would later force Japan to surrender. As the US military achieved successive victories in the Pacific theater, starting from mid-1943, the Allies also successively blocked the Axis powers' offensives in the European and African theaters. In the African theater, the Second Battle of El Alamein, which began in October 1942, shattered the Axis powers' hopes of capturing Egypt to control the Suez Canal and the Middle Eastern oil fields. Consequently, the Axis powers began a strategic retreat in the North African theater. In May 1943, the Allies achieved victory over the Axis powers in the Tunisian campaign, and with the complete surrender of the Axis forces in North Africa, the North African theater came to an end. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, which was resisting Hitler, also reported victories. In February 1943, the Soviet Union successfully halted the German offensive in the Battle of Stalingrad at a great cost, thus eliminating the threat of a complete Soviet collapse. The Axis powers, having suffered enormous losses, were thereafter unable to continue their advance eastward. After gaining the initiative on various battlefronts, the Allies sounded the horn of counterattack. On June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious assault in human history to date erupted in Normandy. In just one day, despite the fierce artillery fire from the Nazi forces, the Allies managed to land 150,000 soldiers in Normandy. Throughout the entire Normandy campaign, over 2 million soldiers successfully landed in France, with the majority being American troops. Approximately 25% of the total Allied forces, possessing formidable combat strength, were involved. The German forces were expelled from the entire Normandy region within a week. On August 25th, Paris was liberated, and by mid-September, almost all German troops had been driven out of France and Belgium. In January 1945, the Allies broke through the Western Front and entered Germany, while simultaneously, the Soviet Union began its final assault on Berlin. On the evening of April 30th, Soviet forces entered Berlin. In the Führer's bunker, Hitler committed suicide. On May 8th, the German forces unconditionally surrendered, marking the end of the European theater of war. As other battlefields concluded one after another, facing Japan's reluctance to accept unconditional surrender, the US military dropped a newly developed, terrifying weapon, the atomic bomb, on Japan's industrial centers Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9 of that year, respectively. The two explosions resulted in the deaths of nearly 200,000 Japanese civilians, ultimately forcing Japan to announce its surrender on August 14th. On September 2nd, Japan signed the Instrument of Surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri, the last battleship of the United States, marking the end of the catastrophic Second World War. Although this calamity had ended, tense and dangerous international relations did not disappear as a result. Coupled with the emergence of the highly destructive atomic bomb, a new game of strategy and confrontation was about to begin under the New World Order. The curtain rises.